Hello and welcome to our instructional screencast for 6th grade social studies. Today we will examine the factors of economic growth that are present in our 6th grade social studies standards. Unpacking the standard is a lot of work. Let's take a look at some of the many elements and how we might work to help your students apply these concepts to their economic understandings. Evaluate how literacy rates affect the standard of living. Explain the relationship between investment in human capital, education and training, and gross domestic product, GDP per capita. Explain the relationship between the investment in capital goods, factories, machinery, and technology, and gross domestic product, GDP per capita. Describe the role of natural resources in a country's economy. And finally, describe the role of entrepreneurship. It is essential to build up background knowledge first with our students for them to appropriately apply these vocabulary terms. I will highlight some of the vocabulary activities that will help your students use these economic terms appropriately. To build background vocabulary, I have a couple of activities that have worked for me repeatedly throughout the years. The first is an oldie but goodie, which is visual vocabulary. Students illustrate as well as define the word in their own terms by simply drawing a picture that embodies a definition. Secondly, skits are a really fun and exciting way to liven up your classroom, using them to give definitions as well as apply these economic terms. They can be very useful when you're trying to describe how literacy rates impact the standard of living. Next, a new game, at least for me, called Heads Up is a fun way to build background vocabulary with your students. Students simply write you, the teacher, write a term on a note card, and the students will be given a couple, somewhere between 6 to 10 note cards with economic terms on it. They do not look at the terms on the card. You divide students into groups of somewhere between 4 to 6 students, and the student whose turn it is lifts up the card, places it on their forehead, and their fellow students have to describe the term without using the words that are on the note card. You then try and get as many words in 60 seconds as you can, and then they rotate the stack of note cards so that every student gets a chance to participate. That's round 1. Round 2, I usually have students do something a little silly but a lot of fun, which is they have to act out what is on the note cards without using words. Because they're now familiar with all the terms, they're able to act out what is on the card without using words. For some reason, round 2 is always louder than round 1, which is interesting but not unpredictable because things can get a little silly. And finally, vocab spheres. Now you can use this on ping pong balls or note cards. I prefer ping pong balls because it makes things just a little more fun and different for students, but note cards work just as well. What you would do with this is students would each choose a ping pong ball or vocab sphere without looking at what was on them, and then they would make a connection with someone else in the room who has a ping pong ball with their own economic term on it. They make the connection and they explain the connection to the class. You may also have it where students choose 1, 2, 3 ping pong balls, and then they have to make a connection to the terms that are on each of those. All of these activities can be used just as practice. They even could be used as a summative assessment if you're creative enough in your grading to be able to think about how you would assess this in creating a rubric. But regardless, they give the students that practice that they need to be able to apply these economic terms so that you can really dig into what the standard means. Now that students have an understanding of the necessary vocabulary, you can teach your students what I like to call social studies math. So this is just a fun way to get kids to think about how these different words impact one another. These are generalizations They are not exact. We never want to use the word always, but it's a good way to see how these economic forces interact with one another. So for instance, if I have a high literacy rate, a large number of people reading, probably means that I have a pretty decent educational system in my country, which means that people are going to have better opportunities for jobs, which means they're going to have better opportunities to make money, which means their standard of living will probably be high as well. If I have a high investment in human capital, with a lot of people with education and training, and a lot of natural resources, then I will be able to use those natural resources in a good way to make money using my education and training, which means that I will have more opportunities to make money, which means that the country will have a higher GDP per capita. If I have a high literacy rate, then that will mean that my GDP per capita will probably also be high in my country because, again, lots of people with education, better job opportunities make more money, higher GDP. This last little social studies math problem I like to add in because it can add a new level to these terms when you're having students negotiate them. Talking about life expectancy and infant mortality rate. High life expectancy means low infant mortality rate, and those relationships to things like literacy rate, standard of living, and GDP. So countries with high literacy rates generally have high standard of living, which means better health care, education, which means that people have better access to medicine, so they will have a high life expectancy and a low infant mortality rate. Once you have gone over how to process what I call social studies math with the students, I like to give them a little practice. So shortening up the terms so you don't have to keep rewriting literacy rate and standard of living, such as a high literacy rate will equal a high standard of living, which will equal a high life expectancy, and then they have to explain why. So the same manner that I did in the previous slide, they have to walk you through why a high literacy rate equals a high life expectancy. And it can become more complex, such as the last problem, which has a large investment in human capital will mean a high literacy rate, which will mean a high number of entrepreneurs, which means that the GDP per capita will also be high. Because if you have a lot of investment in education, it means that a lot of people will know how to read, which means that you will have better education, means you have more opportunities for entrepreneurs, which means that these entrepreneurs can help build the economy and will equal a higher GDP per capita for the country. So having students explain, as I just did, why these systems work the way they do is applying these economic terms and showing how they all interact with one another. Next, let's look at a way that your students can see these terms in action. So I like to incorporate Dr. Seuss's The Lorax into my classroom. It is a great way for students, and a fun way for students to see how these economic concepts work with one another and the environment. The story follows the Onceler, a aptly named character who does not follow good sustainability practices. He finds a tree, known as the truffula tree, that can be turned into a thneed. The thneed is the thing that everyone needs. And this thneed quickly becomes the most sought after product. And the Lorax warns the Onceler, who's the little character pictured here, that he needs to take care of the environment, but the Onceler does not listen. And this means the truffula tree is destroyed along with the Onceler's business. So the Onceler ends up destroying the economy as well as the environment. How you might want to use this film and book in your classroom. So you can read the book with your students, or you could show the film. There is a new version, but I strongly recommend the 1972 cartoon. It's 25 minutes long, so you could watch the entire cartoon, and then be able to apply these economic terms and get a lot of activity with your students, and a lot of discussion still in one class period. So what you might do is you first have students identify the examples of capital resources, human capital, entrepreneurs, natural resources, capital goods, and human migration in the film, and then take it to the next level by having the students use the film to provide examples of standards not only relating to economics, but also relating to geography. So for instance, this standard dealing with Latin America, explain the impact of location, climate, distribution of natural resources, and population distribution in Latin America. Explain how the location, climate, distribution of natural resources impact trade and affect where people live. You will see examples of all of these things in the Lorax, and your students can provide those examples to explain how the standard works. It's worked very well for me in the past, and it gives a little excitement to studying these economic terms with your students, because everyone loves Dr. Seuss. So that about wraps up this screencast. I want to thank you all for your attention and remind you that all the resources in this presentation are available via Digital Commons or Wiki Commons, and I hope you have an excellent school year. Thank you very much.